Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angelka Gemovic, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Novi Sad. And today I will be the moderator of this webinar on the topic of gender equality and gender-based violence. Today's panelists will focus on gender inequalities across various contexts. This webinar is a part of an ongoing series aimed at addressing key societal challenges through an interdisciplinary approach. Today's event brings together two experts and researchers, as well as practitioners, to discuss two deeply interconnected issues, and those are gender equality and gender-based violence. These topics not only reflect systemic inequalities embedded in societies worldwide, but also demand urgent and collective action to foster safety, dignity, and equal opportunities for everyone, regardless of gender. Gender-based violence remains a global epidemic. Just consider this. According to recent statistics of World Health Organization, which can be found online or their official website, 1 in 3 women worldwide has experienced physical or sexual violence, often at the hands of somebody they know. In some regions, these figures are even higher, and that often happens due to cultural norms, poverty, and conflict. Another striking example is the increase in domestic violence, especially during the COVID-19 lockdowns, where victims were disproportionately affected due to being trapped with their abusers. And that is a stark reminder of how pervasive and urgent this issue is. But of course, violence is not always physical, and today we will hear about different forms of violence in different places. Through today's discussion, we aim to uncover the root causes of gender-based violence, to explore pathways to gender equality, as well as to identify actionable solutions that can be implemented across different sectors and different communities. So let's work together to create societies where every individual feels safe, valued, and empowered. You will receive valuable insight in this topic, and you will also have time to exchange with our speakers, both after their presentation, each of their presentation, as well as towards the end of the conference. So now would be a good time to introduce our first speaker, Professor Kari van Dijk. I hope I pronounced it properly. Professor Kari van Dijk is a distinguished academic who has pursued her academic career at several prestigious European universities, combining her expertise in philosophy and the arts with a passion for fostering diversity and inclusion. Professor van Dijk has also brought her insights outside the academic world, addressing diversity and inclusion challenges and promoting equitable practices across diverse organizational settings. Currently, she serves as the program coordinator and lecturer for the Intercultural Communication Certificate Program at LMU, where she equips students with the skills to navigate and thrive in multicultural environments. In addition to her professional achievements, she is an accomplished artist and a philosopher, bringing a creative and reflective dimension to her work. Her interdisciplinary approach bridges the gap between theoretical understanding and practical application, making her a dynamic voice in the fields of intercultural communication and inclusion. Professor, the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you very much for that introduction. I'll try to live up to everything you said. Hello and welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to contribute to this webinar series. My name is Carrie, I'm working at LMU, and I am also part of the Gender Equality Working Group of the UGLO Alliance, the European University Alliance for Global Health. Yeah, in the introduction, the word pathways was used, which I like very much, because in today's presentation, in my presentation, I will be trying to work towards some kind of solution to the problem we're looking at here and addressing in this webinar series. And the word pathway expresses that quite good, I think. So once more, thank you for the introduction. And yeah, here we go, I guess. I want to kind of pick up the thread that I left yesterday in my introduction to the webinar series, and addressing your or directing your attention to a UN resolution from the year 2000, formulated by the UN General Assembly. And in that resolution, the General Assembly states the following. They are concerned that violence against women is an obstacle to the achievement of equality, development, and peace, and concerned that it is an obstacle to the full implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. They state that they're also concerned that some groups of women, such as women belonging to minority groups, indigenous women, refugee women, migrant women, women living in rural or remote communities, destitute women, women in institutions or in detention, the girl child, women with disabilities, elderly women, and women in situations of armed conflict are especially vulnerable to violence. The Assembly recognizes that violence against women is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women, which have led to domination over and discrimination against women by men, and to the prevention of their full advancement, and that violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women are forced into subordinate positions compared with men. Recognizing also that the human rights of women and of the girl child are an inalienable, integral, and indivisible part of universal human rights, and recognizing further the need to promote and protect all human rights of women and girls. Women are human too. They are part of the human realm, and as such, they are equivalent. Equivalence. The condition of being equal or equivalent in value, worth, function, etc. We're not the same, but we're equivalent, right? We're equal in terms of equivalence, which means the condition of being equal or equivalent in value, worth, function, etc. And that being said, I want to state the following. What you truly value and acknowledge, you will not harm. What you truly value and acknowledge, you will not harm. It's really that simple. Stating that inevitably raises a question. It raises the question, what we value and why we value what we do not value, and why we don't value what we do not seem to value. One of the core challenges of the 21st century will be to find ways to accommodate and value all kinds of differences, diversities, scales, and modalities of being and of being together in the worlds we share. And then the question is, how can we do that? And one of the things I would like to propose is that we all try to work towards what I like to call cultures of belonging. Building cultures of belonging will require us to work with three vital building blocks: diversity, belonging, and culture. And then the question is, what do these building blocks refer to? And what do they mean? Diversity as a noun, what it boils down to, it refers to a variety, a range, or conglomerate of many different parts or components that together constitute a whole or several wholes to which these parts belong. And that means that an interdependent, cohesive system or several systems is or are implied. So what diversity implies is, on the one hand, coherence, a cohesive system, and at the same time, differences, whatever they mean and whatever they look like. Now, if you translate that into the human realities we take part in, diversity really refers to the circumstance that we as humans are parts of highly complex socio-cultural ecosystems we, in some way or other, belong to. That's the first building block, diversity, that we need to work with when we want to work towards cultures of belonging. The first building block. The second one, belonging. Belonging, or the feeling that we belong, is a core aspect of our being human and refers to the ways in which we take part in the worlds we share, which has an affective dimension. Second building block. Now the third one, culture. Culture, inasmuch as it refers to something we share, take part in, and belong to, is one of the ways in which belonging becomes tangible on an affective level. And culture is a very, very important building block. It is both a vital transmitter of belonging, as well as an effect of the many ways in which we belong to the worlds we share. So we have three building blocks: diversity, belonging, and culture. Three vital building blocks that are correlative and that we need to work with in order for cultures of belonging to emerge. That being said, having identified the building blocks, what are the challenges, or what might the challenges be? Building cultures of belonging is challenging, since the building blocks we will need to work with, diversity, belonging, culture, all presuppose the notion of a whole and its parts. It's very, very deep in our culture and in the thinking patterns we are programmed with. And that notion is built on the principle of sameness. And that is problematic. Thinking in terms of sameness is problematic if we want to build inclusive environments in which all kinds of differences, diversities, scales, and modalities of being and of being together in the worlds we share can be accommodated. Building cultures of belonging will thus require us to reimagine and reconceptualize the relationality between all parts and the wholes they partake in. Now, what might possible strategies be? Building cultures of belonging in terms of inclusive environments will require us to think of all kinds of different parts in terms of diversity. Building cultures of belonging in terms of inclusive environments will also require us to think of the relationality between all kinds of different parts in terms of equivalence. Equivalence. The condition of being equal or equivalent in value, worth, function, etc. Right? We're not the same, but we're equivalent. Women are equivalent to men. Just to give you an example, right? If we talk about diversity, we're talking about all kinds of differences. And those differences, they are part of an interdependent, cohesive system of several components that principally are equivalent. Women are equivalent parts of the wholes they belong to. Equivalence. And once more, the statement that I want to convey to you: what you truly value and acknowledge, you will not harm. What you truly value and acknowledge, you will not harm. It's that simple. Yeah. Second strategy, right? Thinking in terms of equivalence. First strategy, thinking in terms of diversity. Second strategy, thinking in terms of equivalence. But we have another one. Building cultures of belonging in terms of inclusive environments will require us to think of the relationality between all kinds of different parts in terms of complementarity. Complementarity. Different parts that in some way or other work together, are interdependent, and are vital parts of cohesive systems. Complementarity. The third strategy, right? Thinking in terms of diversity, thinking in terms of equivalence, and thinking in terms of complementarity. And I would like to conclude my presentation today with the following, which builds on that thought of complementarity, but also of equivalence and diversity. We need each other to become part of what we belong to. We need each other to become part of what we belong to. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kari, for this insightful and inspiring presentation. And now we have some time for the first Q&A session. So I would kindly ask all the people who have questions for Kari to write them in the Q&A session. Okay, there is the first one. It says, what role does language play in shaping a culture of belonging? And how can we make our language more inclusive of all gender identities?
Ooh, an interesting question. Yeah, well, language is a vital builder of belonging, or can be a vital builder of belonging. But of course, the challenge is the more diverse a language landscape is, the greater the challenge, of course. So one strategy to build inclusive environments might be to offer whatever you want to present or whatever you want to communicate in several language from the onset on. I mean, that is already done to some extent, but that is a vital strategy that you will need to implement and work with. But there is also the question of inclusive language, right? So the question is not only what languages do you communicate in, but it's also the question, how do you use the language you communicate with, right? And I would like to say that that's at least a definition that I've kind of come up with regard to the topic of inclusive language. An inclusive language is a language that wants to be understood. If you want to be understood, you will use your language in such a way that you get your message across, right? And that, by the way, I mean, inclusive language is a language that wants to be understood, that presupposes that you boil things down to the essentials. And that can be challenging, because that means that you really have to know what you're actually talking about, right? You can't hide behind complicated language or stuff like that, right? If you want to have or get your message across and really kind of build or forge a connection, then you will need to use a language that is able to do that, right? So inclusive language is a language that wants to be understood. And then, of course, mindset. I mean, this whole topic of inclusivity, it presupposes that I'm able to see that I am part of something and that my way of interacting and my way of speaking and the language I use and share is one of many, right? And that in itself, that realization, that creates room uh, in which you can accommodate other languages, other people. So to me, it's also a question of attitude and of mindset, right? And to always be aware that there might be people that might not share your language or might not get your message, stuff like that. So yeah.
I really like this idea of people not sharing your language. So even though you speak the same language, you do not share the same language within the context. So that's very well put. We have another question. It says, there are social and cultural norms that contribute to inequality. How can we change such embedded behaviors to ensure everyone is valued equally?
Yeah, well, there we have the core of the problem, I guess. Yeah, the thing is, I mean, the ways in which we are programmed to interact the ways we do, to perceive the world the ways we do, etc., etc. That programming that has a very deep cultural dimension, right? If you are programmed to look at things in a certain way, then you're programmed that way, and it's very difficult to change it. So I'm not saying that that this is something equal that we're looking at or something easy that we're looking at, because it isn't. So if you ask me, what can we do? One of the things I think, or maybe the only thing that we really can do to bring about change is education. The way I see it is that this topic, right, this core issue of equivalence, and this core question of how can we build inclusive environments? How can we move towards cultures of belonging? That is a core issue and a core question that, the way I see it, should be addressed in every kindergarten, in every primary school, in every university, and in every institution. So the only way I see, the only sustainable way that we really can bring about change is education, making people aware that the standards, the culturally coded standards they live by, that they are just that, culturally coded standards, right? They are culturally coded glasses. And we need to become aware of that they are the effects of a programming. And we need to be able to see that and to be able to relativize that. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to give up all of that, but you have to be aware that it is an effect of culturally coded programmings. And really realizing that makes room, opens up spaces in which interaction with what is different from how you see things or different from how you live your life becomes possible.
Yes, yes. Once again, very well put, especially, yeah, since everything comes from education and everything can be changed with proper education, but it's a hard task to actually accomplish, yes, but not impossible. We have another one. It says, how do we address the intersectionality of gender with other aspects of identity, such as race, disability, socioeconomic status, in creating more inclusive environments?
Yeah, well, what I would like to say about that is, and that touches on the question of multiple belonging, right? If I say we need to start thinking in terms of diversity, equivalence, and complementarity, right? What that entails, the way I see it, is that we have to start thinking of stuff like belonging in terms of multiplicity and multidimensionality, right? And that comprises also culture. And in a way, you could say belonging is multiple, but culture is also multiple. Um, I think it's very, very important to take into account that we all, I would like to say without exception, we're all the effects or the intersections of different culturally coded programmings and different belongings that kind of intersect in us. Everyone here in this group, I would like to state, is part of different cultural groups or collectives and belongs in different groups at the same time. And all those belongings have an effect on our identities and have an effect on how we relate to what we are part of. And that realization, starting to realize that our identities, that the cultures we belong to and the effects they have on us, and that our belonging uh, is multiple, is multidimensional, that builds bridges, right? Starting to see that we're all intersections of different belongings uh, has the effect that we start thinking of ourselves in terms of complexity. And that can help us to deal with complexity and diversity in the outside world. It's kind of a paradox, right? But realizing that you yourself are multiple due to your multiple belongings, and that you are multidimensional might help, and there is research on that, might help to become more tolerant towards diversity and complexity and multidimensionality in the environments you take part in. And that's also the kind of mindset that we really need.
Yes, understanding that you yourself belong to different, yeah, interesting. Okay, we have two more questions. Would you like to answer them now or to leave them? Now is a good time. Okay.
Yeah.
Kat Albiter says, thank you for your presentation. My question is, how can a culture of diversity be built in close-minded societies? How can we contribute to that change?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. The problem is culture. Well, first of all, culture is an effect of the ways in which we belong to the worlds we take part in. And that is something that's unintentional. Culture does that. It has an effect on us, whether we want it or not. But culture can also be used as an instrument to forge realities. And I'm sad to say, to forge what we see more and more happening, to forge very one-sided and one-dimensional realities in which there is no room for differences, right? And if I speak of diversity, what I refer to is the fact that we are all parts of highly complex socio-cultural realities, right? So often when we speak of the word diversity in terms of policy, we refer to a set of categories, right? And then you can think of race and gender, age, ethnicity, and you name it, right? But when I speak of diversity, it goes beyond that, right? It is a reference to the circumstance that we all are parts of highly complex socio-cultural realities. And that is a given, that is a fact. But the question, that is a fact. But the question is, how do, how do certain political forces deal with that, right? And what is the agenda? So you can misuse or abuse culture to forge very one-sided and one-dimensional realities. And that is what we see happening now on a very, very large scale. And I think that is highly problematic, because the way I see it, there will be no way around making room for diversity and build inclusive environments. There will be no way around. And the question is, how do we deal with that? And if we succeed in building inclusive environments, I think that is also something that people need to become aware of. Everyone benefits, right? If we build structures that are truly inclusive, everyone benefits, right? But that is something that we need to work on, and that will require a lot of hard work, but it's not impossible.
Yes. Okay. One last question says, it's a bit long, so I will try to summarize it after I read it. It says, how to make complementarity an active element in spaces that name themselves in the singular. For example, in feminism, which in many occasions ignores as a strength to name itself in plural in order to recognize the diversity that exists within it. Basically, feminism itself is in singular instead of being different elements of it, because the person says, in my opinion, the denial of diversity from language prevents equivalence. So basically, how can feminism itself better recognize and embrace diversity? Instead of relying on a singular term, feminism, it may fail to encompass all within it, but not just for feminism, but in general, in movements and spaces which have singular as a name.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, because yes, feminism is not singular, but it is plural, right? But that goes for, in a way you could say that counts for every industry, that counts for every institution, right? Plurality, multidimensionality is given, is a fact of life, but it's kind of policies or strategies that can have a tendency to narrow everything down to singularity or one-sidedness or one-dimensionality. It's not helpful. And if you ask me, what can we do? Well, I mean, what does it mean to be or to become part of something? We all are part of something to a certain extent, but what does it mean to really take that in? Being or becoming part of something means that I am a part of something, right? That I am not the only one, that I am part of an interdependent system. And that in itself has a relativizing effect on, for instance, my identity, but also my position, my standpoint, and stuff like that. And we need to get the principle of complementarity into our thinking structures and into the way we organize things and in the ways we build policies and strategies. To give you one example, the other day I listened to a highly interesting interview with a scientist with the name of Lisa Kaltenegger. She's an astrophysics. One of the things that she stated in that interview was that the knowledge that we have built together is so vast and so immense that we now have a situation that we need each other to know and to understand. And it has always been like that. But now the vastness of knowledge and the vastness of the things that we can know is so extensive that if we work on something and if we want to find good solutions, we need to combine perspectives. We need to combine disciplines, but that will only work if you're aware of the fact that you do not know everything and you can't know everything, right? So, and that brings me to the aspect of humility. right? You can have your standpoint, and you can be confident, and you can speak up for what you believe in, but you have to be aware that your position is relative. And you have to be aware that we kind of need each other to know. We need each other to find solutions. And we need each other to build inclusive environments.
Thank you. There are no more questions for this part. Once again, thank you so much for this insightful presentation and profoundly answered questions about the identity as well as, of course, gender and inequality that surrounds it. Now, it would be a good time to introduce second speaker, Clotilde Coron. Clotilde Coron is a full professor in management at the University Paris-Saclay, where she also serves as the Associate Dean of Research. She has a PhD in management science, and her academic expertise lies in exploring critical topics such as gender equality in the workplace, including dimensions such as wages, career progression, work-life balance, employment opportunities, and stereotypes. Her research addresses the persistent gender inequalities that remain significant despite numerous legislative efforts across European countries. In today's webinar, she will provide a comprehensive overview of the various dimensions of gender equality and share findings from previous research on the key determinants of these inequalities. Professor, the floor is yours. Just please unmute.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Just to correct one thing, I'm no more Associate Dean of Research, but I'm now Vice President in charge of equality, diversity, and inclusion at Université Paris-Saclay. Thank you very much for your introduction. So my presentation is about gender equality in the workplace. I want to give you some insights about some facts about gender inequalities, some figures also about gender inequalities across Europe, but also tell you some, give you some insights about the causes and the explanatory factors of gender inequalities in the workplace. I wanted to begin by some definition. So when we speak about gender equality or gender inequality in the workplace, we mean inequalities between women and men in the professional life. In fact, there are several and there are many dimensions on which there are inequalities between women and men. I will give you figures just after that. For example, access to employment in many and in all European countries, women have a lower access to employment, to paid employment than men. Second dimension, working time. In many European countries, women are more, they work more frequently part-time than men. Horizontal segregation is the third dimension. Horizontal segregation refers to the fact that women are more present in some jobs, some occupations, for example, in the care sector, and men are more present in other types of sectors, for example, industry. Careers is the fourth dimension. I think you all heard about the glass ceiling, the fact that women face invisible barriers and it's more difficult for women to reach positions of responsibilities inside the companies, for example. So it can also be called vertical segregation. Vertical segregation refers to the fact that when we climb the levels of the hierarchy, there are less and less women. Work-life balance is an important dimension of equality between women and men, because in all the European countries, women spend more time than men doing domestic work. And that's why work-life balance is an important thematic for gender equality in the workplace. There are other dimensions, for example, wage inequalities. In all European countries, women earn less than men. We will see that in the figures. But in this, in the overall topic of gender equality in the workplace, there are also thematics which cannot be quantified or on which it's very difficult to give figures. For example, organizational climate. There are companies, in many companies, the organizational climate is more difficult for, or is less inclusive for women than for men. Stereotypes in many companies and in the labor market, there are a lot of stereotypes about the women's abilities versus men abilities, stereotypes about jobs and the idea that some jobs are more suitable for women than for men, and other jobs are more suitable for men than for women. And of course, there is an important dimension also about the fight against sexual violence in the workplace. Sexual violence in the workplace remains an important issue. And some, as it has been told just before, some women are more victims than men of sexual violence in the workplace, and some women are at particular risk, for example, sexual minorities or disabled women. So this was for the definition. You see that gender equality in the workplace is an overall topic with a lot of dimensions which are intertwined. The European Union has defined a lot of norms about gender equality in the workplace. I just wanted to give you some examples. In 2006, there is a norm, a European norm about equal treatment, and this norm defines direct and indirect discrimination. Direct discrimination refers to situations in which someone discriminates against somebody because of their gender. So, for example, you don't hire a woman because she's a woman, so it's a direct discrimination, even if it might be unconscious. Whereas indirect discrimination refers to situations in which there are criteria which are the same for everyone, for women and for men, so they seem neutral. But these criteria, at the end, disadvantaged women compared to men. For example, in many companies, you have to do some geographical mobility to reach some managerial positions. In some cases, if this criterion is not relevant, this can be considered as indirect discrimination because women are less due to domestic work and due to the organization of the overall society. We know that it's more difficult for women to be to do some geographical mobility. This norm of July 2006, this directive is important also because it opens the possibility of positive actions. Positive actions, it's when you try to correct some pre-existing inequalities. For example, the main example of positive actions is quotas of women, for example. So the European Union in this directive opens the possibility of positive action and says that positive actions, also called affirmative actions, are an important lever for gender equality in the workplace. Other examples of more recent directive in 2019 about work-life balance. This directive introduces makes it mandatory for European countries to define paternity leave of at least 10 working days, which actually is not the case in all the European countries. and strengthens the parental leave. Another directive more recent in 2022 about women in boards. So in European countries, companies' boards will have to include at least 40% of women, or 40% women and 40% of men, at least. And then another, so it's an example of affirmative action. And another example of a directive in 2023, directive very important about pay transparency. Workers will be able to obtain information about wages in their company. So companies will have to give information to be more transparent about the wages in the company. So there are many countries in which, for the moment, it's not the case. So these countries, we have to define local regulation to comply with this European norm. The idea behind this directive about pay transparency, the idea is that pay transparency incitates companies to be more aware of wage, of the gender pay gap and the wage inequalities between women and men. But the other objective of this directive, the other idea is that women, in many cases, they don't know that they are paid less than their male counterparts. So the idea is to make women more aware of the existence of gender inequalities in terms of wages. So I wanted to give you some figures about gender inequalities in the workplace in Europe. So first, about the horizontal segregation of fields of study. So you see here the feminization rate of different fields of study. You see that some, whereas also the overall feminization rate is around 50%. There are fields of study which are in which there are much more women than men, for example, education or health and welfare, whereas it's the other way in other fields of study, such as information and communication technologies or engineering, etc. Now, if we speak about gender inequalities in the workplace, so the first dimension is the question of the employment rate, but also working hours. So as I told you, in many countries, women have a lower access to the labor market, so they are less employed than men. And besides, they are less frequently in full-time jobs. So an important indicator to see that is the full-time equivalent employment rate, which reflect the spread of part-time employment, but also the overall labor market participation. And we see that for every European country, this full-time equivalent employment rate is more important for men than for women. In many occasions, I hear that some people tell me that working time, the question of working time is not really an inequality, because in fact it's a choice from women to work part-time, whereas they could work full-time. So it's a bit more complicated than that, because if we look at the main reason for working part-time in the European Union in 2018, we see that the main reason which is given by women working part-time is looking after children or incapacitated adults. So 29% of women working part-time explain that they do that because they have to look after children or incapacitated adults. Whereas the main reason given by men is that they could not find a full-time job. And other reasons, for example, they have another professional activity. So we see that what we think is a choice, the choice for women to be more frequently, to work more frequently part-time. It's a choice which is very structured and very constrained, in fact, by society and by societal norms about gender, and with the idea that mothers have to look after their children, and they have to put their family before their working life. So we see that women work more frequently part-time, and maybe maybe it's important because if we consider it's a choice, but they have more, they need more flexible work arrangements, in fact. But if we look at the figures, we see that actually men benefit more than women of flexible work arrangements. Here we see that 19% of men work in jobs in which their working hours are entirely determined by themselves, whereas it's the case only for 14% of women. So we see that flexible work arrangement could be a good way to reach or to advance in the way toward gender equality, because flexible work arrangement would allow women to work and to keep on working without making the choice of part-time work, which part-time work, the main problem is that you have a lower salary, so it contributes strongly to gender inequality, to the gender pay gap. So flexible work arrangement could be a good solution, but in fact, men still benefit more than women from flexible work arrangements. I spoke about vertical segregation, the fact that there are less and less women when we climb the levels of the hierarchy. Here we see the percentage of the feminization rate of managers, and we see that across European Union, around 1/3 of managers are women, whereas women represent almost 50% of the labor force participation. And there is another important inequality, professional inequality, is the gender pay gap, which is around 13% in the European Union. This figure corresponds to the gender pay gap computed as the difference between average gross hourly earnings. It means that the question of full-time or part-time work is not included in this figure because we speak about hourly earnings. If we take monthly earnings instead of hourly earnings, we obtain a gender pay gap much more important, of course. For example, in France, the overall gender pay gap is around 25%, whereas it's around here 15% if we use the hourly earnings instead of monthly earnings. So I wanted to conclude my presentation with some reflections about the determinants of gender inequalities in the workplace. There are a lot of determinants, and I wanted to draw your attention on two determinants. First, stereotypes and bias. Stereotypes which come from which are produced and disseminated through socialization. There are gender stereotypes, means beliefs about how men and women should behave. There are gender norms, so how women and men should behave. And there are unconscious bias, which means that unconsciously the same behavior will not be considered or will not be evaluated the same way, depending on the individual's gender. There are stereotypes and bias, but there are also organizational determinants of gender inequality. And in fact, we see that for women, there is an incompatibility, in fact, between gender norms. So as I told you, gender norms, how women and men should behave, beliefs about how women and men should behave, and career norms. For example, gender norms for women, the idea that women should be available for family and children. Whereas career norms meaning the criteria which are important for accessing responsibilities and for succeeding in the professional life. the career norm is being available for work. So of course, for women, there is an incompatibility between both norms. I can give you several examples. Here I give you 2 examples. Another gender norm for women is to develop relational skills. The idea that women are have more abilities in the relational skills. They have more empathy, etc., etc. So this is a belief about women. Whereas in many companies, technical skills are much more valued than relational skills for the career. So there is an incompatibility for women between gender norms and career norms. So it means that there is a paradoxical injunction, because they can get closer to career norms, but if they get closer to career norms, they get farther from gender norms. And if they get closer to gender norms, they get farther from career norms. And in both cases, women are penalized, because when you deviate from a norm, you're always penalized. So it can be one explanation of the remaining gender inequalities in the workplace, despite the numerous laws and norms. So to conclude, reaching gender equality in the workplace will take a lot of time, and the efforts must be made by every stakeholder, public policies, but also companies policy, also education, labor market functioning, etc. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this detailed presentation that gave us practical examples that are easy to understand, but definitely do demonstrate this gigantic gap between genders. And now we have several questions. So the first one says, can you share any specific examples of successful initiatives or best practices that have helped reduce gender disparities in wages or career advancement? Is there any research that has demonstrated the success of gender quotas at some institutions?
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. First, examples of initiatives. I think a lot of successful initiatives are about rethinking the functioning of the organization. For example, you are organizations which try to to conduct a reflection about the criteria of recruitment, or the criteria of promotion, or the criteria of retribution. For example, if you say I recruit for this type of a job, I always recruit with this type of diploma, for example, this type of degree. And an organization which say, okay, I'm going to see if this criterion is as useful as we think, and maybe we can criticize this criterion and find a criterion which is a bit different, but which allow you to recruit more women. Maybe another type of degree, maybe thinking jobs a bit differently. So I think the main, and it's the same for wages. For example, in New Zealand, I have seen that companies have made a lot of work about rethinking the way they consider jobs and the way they pay jobs. For example, in France, and as is the case in a lot of European countries, the most feminine jobs, or the most feminized jobs, are have a lower pay than more masculinized job, for example. And it's not always justified, in fact. So a company which makes an effort and which thinks about every type of job and says, okay, I will check if this job, is it justified that this job is less paid than other types of jobs, for example. So I think these are the most successful initiatives. And to answer your question about quota, yes, there are a lot of research which indicate that quotas are a very effective way of reaching gender equality. For example, in France, there has been a law. There has been a law since 2011 about quotas for women in the boards. And thanks to this law, now in France there are more than 40% of women in boards. And of course, the research also indicates that companies are still performing well, and this law has allowed a more diversified way of recruiting board members, in fact, and the profiles of board members are now more diversified. There are more women, but there are also more individuals with different types of degrees, different types of backgrounds, and so yes, quotas are, I think, an effective way of reaching gender equality.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for answering it so thoroughly. We have another question that says, what role does leadership play in addressing gender inequality? And how can leaders actively promote a culture of equality within their teams? So leaders of the team or of a company.
Thank you for this question. I think leaders play a very important role in gender equality by different ways. First, they can show the importance of the topic. If the company CEO, for example, makes a speech about gender equality or says that the topic of gender equality is important, it will make this topic more important for everybody. And in fact, one of the problems of gender equality is that for many people, it's not so important, in fact, because many people think that there are no more inequalities, or think that it's a choice of women, or think that it's not. Is it very central for the organization? So there is always doubt about the importance of the topic. So if the CEO of the company says that it's important, so yes, it will be important for everybody. So I think it's their first and very important role. Their second role is to be exemplary and to give, yes, to show the best practice, and to, for example, to show that some an individual in a leadership position has to be inclusive, as Carrie said, inclusive being taking in consideration the different needs of the different individuals, and understanding that it's not because you have a different need that you're not performing well, and thinking that the way you organize work can be a bit different, but it's not a problem for the company or for the performance. So I think, yes, leaders have a very important role to play.
Thank you. We have another question that can be answered by both our panelists, since it once again addresses more inclusive language, but you can both provide a perspective on that. So it says, an amazing panel. My question is, how do we try and implement more inclusive language when people have a very bad response to it? How do we show the importance of a change in norms? So maybe you can both answer according to your own aspects and focuses of research. So how can we implement more inclusive language when people have a very bad response to it? For example, in Serbia, our language tends to change now to in a way denote whether a person is feminine or masculine, for instance, a professor. So how do we show the importance of a change in norms when the people, the speakers, do not want to implement such norms in their language?
We have the same problem in French, because the word is not the same if you are a woman or a man, and we tend to use the masculine form of the word as if it was neutral, in fact. So we try to be more inclusive in our language. And there are a lot of people who are against this. So I think the main answer to that is that there are a lot of research which have shown that in fact the brain cannot think in a neutral way, because the brain always visualize, and if you use a masculine form of a word, the brain will visualize a man, in fact. So if you say in French, you say un professeur, which is the masculine form, the person will imagine, even unconsciously, will imagine a man. So I think the main way to answer that is using research. Research has shown that yes, inclusive language is important for gender equality. It's not neutral. In fact, the use of masculine is not neutral, and the research has shown that. So it's not just a fight, or it's not political. It's scientific, in fact. And just another point is that in French, I don't know if it's the same in other language, research has also shown that the French language was much more inclusive before, for example, during the Middle Age. And there was a change because there were other rules in the 18th century defined by the Academy, the French Academia, which was made by men, and the reasons invoked by men were sexist reasons, where they say that men were more important than women. That's why we can use the masculine as if it's natural, in fact. So this change is sexist, and using inclusive language is not. It's just go back to a more egalitarian way of thinking things.
Thank you. Professor Van Dijk, do you have anything to add to this matter?
I agree with everything Clotilde has said, really. Maybe one thing I would like to add is that, what I commented on with regard to inclusive language. Inclusive language is a language that wants to be understood, right? And language, it's the same as culture. Language can be misused as an instrument of power to sediment certain inequalities. So lead by example, to pick up on something that Clotilde said, if you want to have an inclusive environment, that, the way I see it, entails an inclusive language that kind of takes into account that you have a diversity that kind of needs to be included in whatever you are doing. And that asks of you to speak in a certain way that not only takes that into account, but that contributes to shaping an inclusive environment. And that also means that the words you use, but also how you speak. And I'm sorry to say, people will instantly get whether you include them in the way you speak or not. And then we're back to this question of attitude and mindset. If you are if you have a mindset that really wants to include everyone present at a table or in a team structure or whatever, you will behave and interact and speak accordingly. It's as simple as that. And people instantly pick up on stuff like that. So to be inclusive requires you, or to behave in an inclusive manner and to shape an inclusive environment requires you to have an inclusive mindset.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a very logical pathway and yeah, very, very simply put. Another question we have says, in your view, what are the next critical steps that organizations and policymakers need to take to accelerate progress towards true gender equality in the workplace?
I think that the most important thing that policymakers could do is to show companies that it's no more possible to have gender inequalities, and for example to cut the access to public markets, for example, or to for companies which do not comply with their legal duties about gender equality. I also think that the question of parental leave is very important, and I think that the countries which have made the paternity leave more a larger paternity leave, a longer paternity leave, I think it's a very important measure also, because a lot of inequalities about the domestic share of work, the share of domestic work, most inequalities about the share of domestic work are produced during this period in which in many countries the maternity leave is much longer than the paternity leave, and I think it's a very important measure to reduce gender inequalities in the share of domestic work, and which contribute to reduce gender inequalities in the workplace.
Thank you. Another question says, in reference to sexual violence in the workplace, is this only physical violence, or does this include sexual harassment? Does it also include verbal abuse, harassment? And is it difficult to get accurate data on this?
Yes, so sexual violence in the workplace also includes sexual harassment, and it also includes verbal abuse and harassment if it's because the victim is a woman. So, for example, if there is an insult which refers to the fact that the person is a woman, yes, it can be considered a sexual violence in the workplace. There is a survey, a European survey, which is called a European Working Conditions Survey, in which there are questions about the exposure to violence in the workplace. There are questions about physical violence, sexual violence such as rape, and also verbal violence such as humiliation or aggressive sentences. So you can get the data from this survey.
From the survey. Okay. Another question says, thank you once again. My question goes to Professor Caron. Do you know if there are any mechanisms for companies or institutions to identify and control more covert forms of discrimination? For instance, when a manager uses his lunch break, his free time, to discuss business projects with male colleagues only.
Yes, it's very difficult to quantify this type and to identify this type of thing, which is very common. In fact, as I told earlier, there are dimensions of gender equality which are very difficult to measure. And I spoke about organizational climate, and I think it refers to the example you give. There are surveys in which employees are. There are questions about their well-being, their relationships with their supervisor, their relationships with their colleagues. And I think maybe it's a good way to identify this type of problem. But of course, it's very difficult to act on this type of problem. I think maybe formalizing the processes of promotion, of retribution, etc., can be a good way to make sure that even though there are male supervisors which who construct like a male networks, or even though they do that, it's not a problem for career of women, because every HR process is formalized, and the criteria are formalized. So even though you know your colleagues better because you are a man, and he's a man, and so you speak about male things and etc. Even though you have this advantage, it will not be an advantage in the official process. So maybe an answer, but of course it's difficult we cannot control everything, and
Thank you. We have another question which actually describes the whole situation, and I believe both of you can contribute to that. It says, "Hi, I'm from Ecuador, and in my workplace, especially in academia, I've noticed situations where, despite having the same qualifications and often being the ones proposing solutions, ideas are sometimes taken less seriously compared to our male colleagues. In many cases, these ideas are only validated when presented by male coworkers. This creates frustration, and when we try to address it, the situation worsens if the person perpetuating this behavior is someone in a position of power, like a director. My question is, how can we effectively address gender bias in such hierarchical structure where questioning authority might lead to further discrimination or retaliation?"
Carrie, you want to begin?
Well, that's a difficult one. That's really a difficult one because, as we've already stated, I mean, if you ask the question, how can we actually change things? What you're addressing now, that is often, yeah. Then I think you have to bring in the aspect of culture, right? You can have cultures in certain organizations, and often they are the effects of, yeah, longer periods of time in which certain power relations have crystallized, and yeah. So how do you change that? Difficult. I think what is important is to you need people that become aware of that. And then, of course, becoming aware of that certain things are the way they are, that is not enough. You also need some kind of openness or a culture in which things like that actually can be addressed. But how do you do that? Right, that is so. And then I think I'm back to the topic of what Clotilde talked about, the question of leadership. So I think if you think in the long term, you need really good management. You need good leaders that have good values, that are inclusive, and only in that way, I think, in organizations can you actually bring about change. And of course, they do that together, right? Culture is something that we co-create, and that is an effect of all the ways in which we interact, right? But leadership is vital because in a way you set the tone. So that is one of the things that I would kind of try to highlight, maybe. Yeah.
I agree. It's a very difficult situation. Maybe you can think more long term, and think that one day you will be yourself a leader, and you will try to do things differently. In fact, we cannot always fight and put ourselves in danger, or career in danger, just to fight for some causes, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I don't know who of the both of you said that. I mean, it's often also kind of you cannot always control things. You cannot always control dynamics. You cannot, as one part of a company culture or institutional culture, change everything. And why should you want that, right? So you cannot always control things. But I think, yeah, maybe the most productive thing you can do is to stick to what you really believe in, and what you want to work on, and to continue doing that. Yeah, it's it can be challenging, but that is one of the things that I would yeah, that I would suggest. And then, yeah.
Thank you. Another question says, what do you think is the most effective measure taken by European governments to tackle gender discrimination?
I think that, as I told earlier, the measures about paternity leave are very important. Quotas, I think it's a good, an effective way to address some gender inequalities. Pay transparency, I think it can be. We don't have a as it was in 2023, and a lot of countries have not already put that in their local regulations. So we have not seen the effect yet, but I think it can be an effective measure.
Yes, definitely. Another question says, another person says, thank you for your presentation. Would you agree that different inequalities towards women can be reduced to an unequal distribution of power? Can we put this problem solely in terms of power distribution? Isn't being inclusive the same as sharing power?
Yes, I think Carrie can answer also, but it's an interesting question. I'm not sure of the answer, because on the one side, yes, I think if women have the same power as men, it would solve a lot of gender inequalities. But on the other hand, I'm a bit frustrated by this way of seeing things, because we could also think that one way to be more inclusive would be to grant less importance to power. In fact, to say that the society would be more inclusive if power would be less at the center of the society. So I'm not sure of the answer.
Can I add something? I totally agree. And I also think it might be maybe a step forward to reconceptualize or to reimagine what power actually is, or could be, or should be. I mean, you can have an organization or a team structure which is diverse in itself. A structure is in itself diverse, and you have all kinds of different parts and different tasks and responsibility, and that extends to the person actually in charge, or the leader, or whoever you call the person. It can be a couple of leaders, or whatever. But I think if you start to reimagine what power is, what it consists of, and what it can look like, that might also contribute to building more inclusive environments. And one thing I would like to add, I mean, if you have a structure and you will have people that have more responsibilities and are in charge and are the people taking decisions, right? That is totally fine. However, that being said, you can still meet eye to eye with the people you interact with. And you can meet eye to eye with actually everyone, right? So, yeah, to have or to be a leader in a structure, or right, to have that kind of responsibilities, that is one thing. But the question is, how do you interpret that leadership role, and how do you live it, and how do you interact with the people that you are actually dependent on to create something, right?
Yes. There are two more questions, and then we should wrap up. The first one says, do you know if there are measures put in place specifically for managers in companies to help them recognize, identify, and fight their own prejudice, especially if they don't know they act according to their bias?
Yes, I think one example of a measure is the test of implicit association implicit. So it's a test in which you can identify your own unconscious bias. It's online. It's called TAI or AIT, I think, in English. So it's developed by Harvard University, and people can experiment and identify their own unconscious bias. So I use that with my students, and it always gives a very interesting result.
Yeah, can I add something? I also think education. So maybe workshop programs or stuff like that that give people an opportunity or the chance to become aware of it. And I mean, we all have stereotypes, and we're all biased to some way or in some way or other. So I think that is important, but also maybe to contribute to a culture in which we can hold each other accountable. And kind of address things. I mean, we're all biased, we all have stereotypes. It's not about that. And you don't need to go around and say, oh, now you're being very biased. Oh, that was a stereotype, right? And counting. It's not about that. But if it's really something yeah, something important, or really something where you feel, well, this was maybe stepping over the line or whatever. I think it's important that you have a culture where it is okay to maybe address that. So that might also be helpful.
Uh, Everybody in chat, we have a link to do the test and determine how biased we are. So I think we should all do that after this session. There are two more questions, but we unfortunately do not have time to answer them. Maybe we could answer in writing, or maybe they were already partially answered. So it would be a good time to wrap up. Thank you both. This was a marvelous discussion that really was eye-opening and thought-provoking. On behalf of everyone here, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to our speakers. Gender equality is profoundly important, and it has different aspects, and your contributions definitely have shed light on its complexities. I would like to thank the UGLO Alliance for organizing this wonderful webinar. I will see you tomorrow, where we will further discuss this issue. Thank you all, and have a lovely day.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.